You're listening to Barbell Logic,
the podcast where we talk about what it means to experience strength
and how you can use simple, hard, and effective strategies in training and nutrition to improve your life.
It starts with meeting you where you are right now and finding lasting solutions.
Welcome to the show. Welcome to the Barbell Logic podcast. I'm here with Niki, Sims, and with CJ today.
Ahoy.
Welcome, guys.
I've missed everybody.
Yeah, it's been a while since all three of us have podcasted together. And there's been a lot of travel and block party conference talks. CJ, I think yours is coming up, if it hasn't already been released by the time this one comes out, on how to survive social media and not go crazy.
That was fun.
You all are going to need to check that one out. You had some really important gems in there on like creating a good way to have a healthy relationship with social media. I think it's good.
Yeah.
I think it's great.
Carl's came out last week on Ariete. Is that how you say it? Did I say it right?
Arete and glory.
Yeah. And excellence. And I would have liked to have given a little like minute intro to that, but I've been traveling like crazy, and we've been in Denver on business and doing seminars together and doing all that kind of stuff. So it's been a blast attending seminars, not putting on seminars, which has been also fun.
That was different. I hadn't attended a seminar in a really long time.
Yeah, we've put on so many and haven't been an attendee, so it was fun. So when you heard that one from Carl, most people probably picked up on this when they hear somebody speaking like, oh, this is an address to a crowd. We're letting you guys have a little bit of a sneak peek into the block staff conference that we did last month. Today, we want to talk about introducing new exercises for your clients. We did this a couple years ago. Scott and I did talking when our listeners at Barbell Logic were primarily more new clients or new lifters moving into the intermediate phase. And they were like, would my coach add a supplemental lift, or why would they choose this one? And as the audience has moved more into barbell enthusiasts, advanced lifters, up and coming coaches, we can really kind of come from that angle today. And so, how you should choose as a coach a supplemental lift, or when to introduce new exercises to your clients lifting, or still even as more advanced lifters or more barbell enthusiasts understand why your coach is picking those for you. So really quick, I'll set this up for you guys. I want you to run with it for a bit. I still use a lot of the MED principles that we use for programming, those ideas of we want to keep it simple as long as we can. As long as simple is working, let's stay with simple if we can. And we'll talk about novelty a little bit and why you would want to introduce that at some point. Economy over excess, right? We don't want workouts to take forever. So I don't want to do extra exercises and extra slots just for doing them. We need to have a reason for doing everything. And we tend to lean towards intensity over volume as well. Although I certainly think that as you start to bring in some of these additional lifts, then there is some argument for why you would lean on these for getting more volume, getting more tonnage, getting more work, especially even density of work in a specific amount of time. When we first start programming, we think about the three big variables of intensity, volume, and frequency. How heavy, how much, how often. And the fourth big variable that we start to talk about is exercise selection. It changes those things, right? And it wouldn't necessarily have to change volume, intensity, or frequency, but that exercise selection is an additional variable that we introduce. CJ, I'll start with you. As you start to approach exercise selection and work new exercises into your client's program, like how do you systematically, logically sort of think about it? What's the strategy for bringing those on? Ooh, my voice cracked like I was 13. Me. Okay, good. What is the strategy for bringing those on?
So for me, it depends on the class of client that I've got. It's interesting breaking down intensity, volume, frequency, and then exercise selection, because normally, like if it were someone randomly out of the blue who I never know, I would think exercise selection first.
Good. Yeah.
But because after all, if someone doesn't care about their, squat going up doesn't matter, then I'm not going to have them squat. But the kind of people who come to a Barbell Logic coach, the kind of people who kind of know the value of general strength in their lives, and that's how they want to start, like they've already decided these 6 kind of core exercises are going to hit my bases. So for me, I generally find that people who come to us and the people who come to me, even if they have a diverse set of end goals, they're funneled in tight enough that, okay, they're interested in general strength. We're going to be doing squats, deads, presses, bench, chin, rows, some exercises like that. So I have this window of like 3 months, 4 months-ish that we're just going to get stronger, and people are generally okay with that. But like I'm paying real close attention to what the next step is, because the kind of funnel they channel themselves into based on what they want really determines how I think about exercise selection. A lot of the usual criteria does someone want to be a strength sport athlete, or does someone, they just want to get a bigger squat because going from 3 plates to 4 plates was awesome. Let's do 5 plates. Like those two, a lot of those supplementary and accessory and how we choose range of motion things, a lot of those tactics apply. And then when somebody, like, let's say there's a missing movement pattern, I've always wanted X goal that seems somewhat kind of arbitrary or random, but it really is meaningful for them, or somebody who's taking on a specific sport or endurance, or a military task. Like that tends to funnel them down a slightly different chute. So I guess that's where I would start, is in that first 3-4 months of relating, like, are they on the strength chute? Are they in the, alternate goals? But for them, that's just as important as in their chute, in their sport, strength, mission, life.
Yeah, it's good. Even in strength, you've got people who are just wanting to be generally strong for life and improving quality of life. And you've got powerlifters who the sport is to be as strong as possible. And the way you would select supplemental lifts or additional exercises, I think would be different for both of those. For somebody who literally wants to lift the most weight possible under the rules of powerlifting versus someone who wants to be generally strong for improvement of quality of life. So yeah, that's a great point. And in the beginning, we're just really general, right? Everybody does mostly the same thing and just gets generally strong. And then that's a great point that at pretty quick, you start to move them on a track towards what their goal is. Nikki, how do you think about them?
I love what you said there, CJ, about like, why are they here? What are you coming here for? And if it's barbell training, then it's pretty obvious that we're going to kind of stick with the big 4. And when they're not sure what they're coming here for, or if it's a little more broad, then I just want to get stronger, then we do kind of funnel them into that anyway. And then the interesting thing that I think comes up is there's like the battle in the coach's mind of, should I make this more complicated now? Like, is it time? Like, we're almost like trying to restrain ourselves and introducing some more variety, especially when we know a lot of different exercises, or we're just like really curious about what kind of supplemental exercises we can do. So it's like, do I need to just stay the course a little bit longer or is it time to work something in? And I think a lot of times it comes in from, in the online environment, a movement that we're trying to correct, that we just know by giving a variation to an exercise, it would really help us like just isolate a certain part of squat, a certain part of the deadlift. CJ, you've been coming out with these on the Barbell Academy Instagram, like ways you can change the movement just a little bit to work on a form correction, because you get like lighter weight, but like a more targeted approach to what you're working on. So I think that works really well in the online environment. And then it'll come from the conversation that comes up oftentimes with the client of like, I want my arms to be bigger, or I want to see my abs more. I, in my case, want to have just an infinitely bigger and bigger butt. So like what things that...
Like I want a body weight pull up.
Yeah, exactly.
I want, or whatever.
Mm-hmm. There's like the side goal that sneaks in.
Exactly.
And then you're like, okay, what little bits can we start feeding into the program that will work towards that? And one thing that I think is really interesting when that comes up is like, we think that with the base layer of strength, we just add in this one accessory and it's going to happen really quickly, but it takes just as much time as getting generally strong overall. Like those little supplemental variations, and when you start adding in accessories, try and get bigger, you still need months of stimulus. It's not like, oh, cool, we're going to do curls now and you're going to be just bursting out like CT Fletcher. Yeah. So it's an interesting kind of balance of like, do we need this complexity? Okay, we have this new goal. Okay, let's introduce the new complexity to work in that direction, but also we still need to just settle into knowing that we need time. Time is the constant variable, or not even a variable. Time is just like a constant
the consistent
need.
Constant.
Yeah.
Yep. It's interesting. I heard you say, and from really a different perspective, I had written down novelty is one of the first reasons we add exercises, if we're just being honest, right? A lot of strength coaches don't want to talk about novelty. Interestingly enough, I've always thought about that novelty from the client perspective. Like the client gets bored with just 4 exercises and they need more. But I heard you mention something like sometimes the coach needs the novelty. Sometimes the coach is like, I kind of want to bring in a box squat or whatever, right? Whatever the thing is.
I think it's time. I've been looking at the same thing on the same screen over and over. I'm tired of copying and pasting. Like, let's throw in a pause squat.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, that's just addressing the human element.
Yeah.
We all probably have clients who are robots and can just do the main lifts all the time or never change. And they're just like, I'm just going to do whatever you tell me to do. I'm just going to check it off the list and do the thing. And then we have other clients that, about 3 weeks in, they're like on a basic novice linear progression. They're like, hey, can we do some extra this, and this? And you're like, not yet, and those clients you have to move a little earlier. I think as a coach, you've got to be professional enough to be able to say like, I don't want to add novelty just for novelty's sake from the coaching perspective. But you're right. If you've seen hundreds and hundreds of reps of just a normal squat and you're like, yeah, there's some stuff I'm not crazy about, but I just can't fix it looking at this. That's a perfectly fine reason to add a new novel squat and probably not take away the main squat. Like sometimes we have to for injury or we change the things, but a lot of times the big lifts stay in the program and then we start to add variations on top of those and rotate those in and out. So maybe it's something like a box squat comes in for a while and then it will move out for a while and then move back in. Whereas a normal sort of basic competitive squat may stay in all the time and never move off of somebody's program. So yeah, I think that's good. It's interesting to think about the novelty from both. We have two humans at play here if you have a coach.
Yeah.
The client and the coach. Both sometimes need novelty.
Yeah. I'm like reminded for some reason we were all together in Denver. We went to a poke bowl restaurant and it's like kind of like a Chipotle version where you get to put on whatever you want. And it was like so overwhelming, like all the options. And by the end of mine, it just looked like this total mess. And I was like, man, that's that's what your program could look like if you're just like, those look neat. I don't know what those are. Let's throw them in. And then that looks really fun. Like, let's add that in. And then when you're eating your poke bowl, it's like, I don't really get a strong flavor of anything. It's just kind of this weird collection. And even with like when you're adding accessory and supplemental movements in, like you can kind of just dilute everything because stuff will fight each other. You're stealing recovery one from another, and you're not really making the important things continue to shine. I don't know.
That's good.
If I could, there's the lifter, there's the coach, and I think there's an element to a third. There's like the changing dynamic between the two in the sense that, let's say we got the person the same 6 exercises, the same, the core 4, chins, barbell rows, something like that. They've been doing it and they're consistently making really slow progress at this point, but they're still making measurable progress over time. They've been doing this consistently for 6 to 8 months. They haven't said anything like that they don't like what they're doing. And you as a coach, you could keep doing the same thing. You could continue that. I think there's a level to which if we don't explore into new territory at all, we can't be surprised. The lifter can't be surprised that, oh, I really like this. The coach can't be surprised that, their gains actually improved over time. Or, this constant low grade, like, yeah, I'm sore, coach. It's just that sort of resolved when I made this change. So I think there's also an advantage to novelty in the sense that if we say, I will do what works for my client. That's what, I'll adapt to what works. I'll adjust to what works. If we don't test an alternative, which is novelty,
We're not really doing that.
Then we can't know what works.
We're not really doing what we say.
All we know is that this has worked well enough.
So you're giving yourself some context and perspective. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I was thinking about this novelty, and I do think that there is some additional reasons beyond just the human element for why we use it. And one of the things I put, and CJ kind of started to address this, is it allows for more consistent PRs. As a client becomes more intermediate and advanced, it becomes much more difficult to hit PRs frequently, weekly, workout to workout on the 4 big lifts or the 5 or 6 big, whatever you've done over and over again. But as you rotate in supplemental lifts, it's very easy to hit PRs on those and have that little dopamine rush of like, oh, I hit a PR. I hit a new 5 rep max on the deficit deadlift and then a new 3 rep max and then a new single and then rotate. And then you kind of extract out what you can out of that. And then you can rotate in a new supplemental lift. And we'll talk about how we choose those and like specifically what we do, but just from a 30,000 foot view. And you can start getting PRs there as the PRs start to slow down on the supplemental lift. You just pull it out and put a new one in. Maybe that also addresses that human element, but we are constantly chasing those PRs. And then I love to put that supplemental lift back in a few months later and try to break new PRs on those. And I think it does allow for more consistent PRs when the PRs start to really slow down on the other lifts.
And usually the variation, well, sometimes they're more fun and easier, but sometimes they're just harder parts of the lift, like a pause deadlift or a tempo squat or a box squat. And so when you add those in and you get to do the regular lifts, you're like, oh my God, I love these so much.
Right.
It makes you appreciate the regular lift.
That's right. You go from a deficit deadlift back to a regular deadlift or a pause squat to a non-pause squat. You go back to like, oh, I can use speed now on the squat. You're like, this is great.
Yeah,
this is so much better.
You had me do box squats for a long time and nothing made me love regular squats more.
That's right. So I'm brutal about the way I coach a box squat too, right? Where you have to hold form, totally pause, no rocking, stay on midfoot, completely break the eccentric concentric chain, and then fire
and
up.
then inside, you're
like, this
dying
sucks.
inside, dying inside.
joy.
And then on the video, it's like, my looks like you can put on more weight. You're like, no.
This looks fine. You're like, please rotate out. Please rotate out. So yeah, so let's talk about, there are really a couple types of additional exercises we can add. There are supplemental exercises and there are accessory exercises. This has sort of become pretty common vernacular among strength coaches. So supplemental exercise is a variation on one of the main barbell lifts, typically. So it is not quite the same thing as a competition squat, but it is a type of squat. So it could be a box squat or a pause squat or a pin squat or a tempo squat or a safety squat bar squat, or pick any other bar squat. That's a supplemental lift. And you could do the same thing with all of the other lifts as well. And you have accessory movements, which tend to be a little more isolation movements, a little less compound. And they can also be done for higher rep ranges to add additional volume. They're usually put in there for hypertrophy. I would argue that most of the time, and well, I'll throw this out to you guys to see if you agree with this, supplemental exercises tend to be there to address a weakness or address a movement pattern issue. And accessory exercises tend to be there to add volume and hypertrophy, because eventually we've got to add muscle mass if we're going to keep getting stronger. Would you guys generally, I realize I'm painted with a broad brush there, but is that how you tend to look at it as well?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Like the supplemental often will take the same series of joints through a very similar range of motion, whereas the accessory lifts will take way fewer joints, like maybe just one joint, maybe two joints through a pretty significant range of motion. So it's like you said, compound versus isolation, that has a lot to do with it. And it just like the supplemental will look pretty much the same with slight variations, I think, in angle and range of motion.
I think for me, I would agree with that general brush of, kind of how we categorize accessory, kind of how we categorize supplemental, in part because the fact that it's one joint, two joint, it's less complex, it's less skill dependent. That means it's the first time we really can intelligently do 25 reps of anything. I'm not going to have anyone do 25 reps of squat. That's a waste of time. At least for any of the clients I've worked with, it's just, why would we be in that weird muddled middle? We'll either be heavy on the squat, or we can do GHRs or any one of a number of other exercises if we need to push into those high rep ranges. Where I see like the conversation between supplemental and accessory, for me, a lot of it carries with it some assumptions that are super important to me down that channel. If you're a competitive power lifter, my first task after getting you generally stronger, like I've got a lot of people who they don't really know what they want. They just know what they want to get stronger. And then they're like, I'd like to try this powerlifting thing. I'd like to try this, strength lifting or strongman or whatever. And so from that point, if you want to be a competitive powerlifter, one of my first tasks is to find out like sumo or conventional deadlift, if you actually want to get the highest points on the platform. And as I start deciding what is a supplemental lift, first for me is, what is your competition lift?
Yeah.
And then because the touch and go bench is a supplemental lift for a power lifter. Now, if someone wants to get just generally strong, then whatever lift we find that they're comfortable with and have been getting PRs on, that's the core lift from which we have supplemental and accessories to drive. So whichever, again, that funneled path that the lifter puts themselves down, that we're kind of sensitive to and trying to figure out in that learning phase, that decides for me a lot of how those first exploratory choices are going to go.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, if you're a powerlifter, the wide grip, arched, paused bench is now the main bench press. This is the competition bench press. And a normal, what we would give to most novices in a bench press, the touch and go, normal grip, not a ridiculous arch, that is now a supplemental lift for a powerlifter. Right? And I would argue that it would actually elicit better general strength gains, but not as specific to the sport. So once we get beyond the goal and the track the client's taking, at that point, how do you start to pick the supplemental exercises? Do you go based off weak points? Like, okay, they're kind of weak off the floor on a deadlift, so I'm going to do a deficit as opposed to something else. Or it's a movement pattern. We got a little bit of a movement pattern issue here, so we're going to try to attack that. How do you pick your supplemental exercises?
Man, I'm curious to hear both of how you do this, because I think there are a lot of different things you can throw in there. Like, you can choose if you want to make your supplemental lift heavier or lighter than the main lift. Like you can do rack pulls, or you can vary the weight throughout the range of motion with chains or bands. You can do a slingshot bench press. So if you want to overload a part of the range of motion, I think those are really useful. I like to do that for like chains and slingshot when a lifter prefers to keep the full range of motion. I've had some give me feedback that if we just work on certain parts of the movement, it's like they take that too much into the regular movement, interestingly. So if they like to maintain the practice of a full range of motion, but I still want to make it heavier, that's where like something like a slingshot or chains or bands are really useful. But yeah, it's kind of like you were saying, Matt, like maybe there's something that's going on in the deadlift where it's like, wow, all of a sudden at this intensity, we're seeing this situation occur. So let's kind of isolate that specific part of the range of motion and make the rest of it kind of easier. And that specific portion, I guess I don't want to say easier, but it's like, let's see that error significantly so we can address it.
So as someone comes out of that first 3 to 6 months and we're now choosing programming choices for supplemental accessory lifts, the first thing that usually comes up, there's usually some lingering technique problem, especially online. We're not able to be there in person. It's harder to implement cues. Normally, my first go-to will be a drill variant for some kind of technical issue, whether that's a pause to draw attention to a specific point of the movement, whether that's a tempo so that they can just slow down at a still heavy weight, but, especially hip-knee timing in the squat, tempos are huge for that. So usually it's a movement pattern first that I end up addressing with clients. Next, after that, I tend to bracket. So Niki outlined all these where you're choosing an easier variant, usually a shorter range of motion or something for a heavier load, so favoring intensity, or a harder variant where the movement is itself inherently limited. So for a lighter weight, the obvious example is rack pull deficit deadlift. If I'm doing 3 deadlifts a week before, let's say just as an example, I might keep up one conventional and then bracket for the other 2 exercises. For me, I think there are clear reasons to use the exercises, like use specific supplementals, but especially for that first part, that first maybe, again, 3 to 6 months into this selective phase, a lot of it to me is exploratory. So a lot of it is what breaks down when they do a deficit deadlift, what breaks down when they do a rack pull.
Yeah.
For me, I found out that my rack pull was actually weaker than my deadlift. That was a, hold on, and fixing that, doing rack pull work blew my deadlift up at the point from 500 to 550 in about, 4 or 5 months at that time in my life. So I couldn't have looked at that and looked at my technique and, gotten the kinematics and said, okay, here's where your force velocity curve dies down. So we're going to do a rack pull 2 inches below the kneecap. No, it was an exploratory choice that exposed an issue.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. You can't always see it, especially in a client, as you start to introduce these exercises, you don't know necessarily where the weak points are. And what you do is you pick a supplemental lift that's giving you good return on investment from the vast majority of all of your other clients, and you pick it, and then sometimes they're like really good at it, and sometimes they suck awful at it. And they're like, that was so hard, and the weight is way lighter than you think it's going to be, right? And by the way, because of that, because it's exploratory, this is one place when the very first week I add a new exercise, I almost always assign it with RPE. It's one of the only times I actually program with true RPE because I just don't know. It's too hard to just guess in the ether of like, is this gonna, like, I don't know. Again, like CJ, I've coached both you guys, it's like you start to do rack pulls with CJ. Like, I don't know the rack pulls are going to be harder for CJ. So it's like, okay, you're going to work up and hit it for a set of 5 or a set of 3 at an RPE 7 or RPE, like leave 2 reps in the tank or 3 reps in the tank. Help me find the starting point. I even usually write that in the notes. Mostly I think because I've got PTSD about RPE, and I think my clients are going to be like, are you programming lazy now? And so I always put in the notes, I go, help me find the weight on week 1, and then I'll program the weights for you from here on out on the supplemental lift. And so because it is exploratory, you just don't know. So yeah, that's a great point.
And I think I hesitated, a few years back to assign RPE for a newer exercise, a supplemental exercise, an accessory exercise in particular. My thought would be because of my frustration, I had a coach at one point who would cycle in a new accessory or supplemental lift once every 1 to 2 months. And I only saw that lift once a week. So by the time I really dialed in RPE, what an RPE 8 in the good morning was for me, I may not even have it dialed in before we're already rotating.
It rotates
again.
out. Yeah.
But I've grown a lot more comfortable with it with a new exercise over time because I'm going to stick with it longer than a month or 2, for one. And for 2, it doesn't have to be right. Like, I don't have to dial in an RPE 8 and an accessory exercises in a dip. or something like that.
Right.
I can go conservative and then linearly progress up.
Yes.
Or whatever you felt today, looking at the video, whatever that felt like, harder. Like, let's bring that up. Whatever language we use, we can tailor it without necessarily feeling stuck.
So we pick sometimes for novelty. We pick sometimes for weak points. We pick sometimes for movement pattern issues. And then sometimes we just know it's sort of time to add something. And we just, from an exploratory standpoint, we're like, let's see how you do with the deficit deadlift, or and I don't think there's a right, let's say the first deadlift supplemental exercise you pull in, people listening, they're like, which one should I do? I don't think it matters. Like, if you don't know, like if you have a hard time breaking something off the floor, yeah, let's start with deficits. Everything else about those movement patterns are fine. I don't care if you start with a deficit or a rack pull. Again, you're just like CJ said, let's figure out what's hard. Let's figure out what breaks down. Let's figure out what's more stressful than it should be and figure out why and kind of start building up that weak link.
I think the only other one that came to mind through our conversation that I do use, it's like an anticipatory choice. Somebody says, I would be really interested in ollie lifting, or ollie lifting looks really cool. Maybe I'll do that someday. Then as we're getting to that point where the lifts are getting heavy, and I find that a great opportunity to introduce the front squat.
Yeah.
Being a core part of the Olympic lifts, not because they're going to go down that path. Maybe they just described an interest, but it's a useful supplemental lift. It's a way to break up squat volume. And now if they choose to go that way, we've already been putting in some work in that. They know the lift. And since we don't want to be throwing in like 20 supplementals all at once, like I don't want to shift them from straight core 4 to all of a sudden we're doing snatches, clean and jerks, power cleans, like all those lifts all at once. Introducing them in advance 1, 2, 3 at a time, some core Olympic lifting exercises can really make that transition easier. And it's not hard if they decide, I don't want to do that. I want to do something else.
Yep.
It's not like they lost something from doing front squats.
Yeah. Still got valuable work.
Like if you only see a certain error at high intensity, but you can't have your lifter at a certain point in their advancement keep doing like, well, time for another set of 1RMs and 5RMs, and you just can't push them there. Like,
yeah, right.
You need to be able to see that error by recreating the intensity, but not in a way that's having them do PRs. So like,
right. Doesn't have to be heavier.
Make it harder so you could see the deviation that occurs only in a state of high intensity.
This is why I didn't used to use tempos very much early on in my career. I use them all the time now. Tempos work great to fix timing, bar path, midfoot balance issues, because what you're doing is, one, you're actually making it more beneficial for both the client and the coach, because one, it slows down enough for the client that the client can feel the error. Most of the time, the client can't feel the error. You get to the bottom of the squat, they kind of over rock back on their heel, and then they hit the bottom of the squat and they go to the toe or the ball, and then right back to the heel. And you get that little like, oh, you just went heel, toe, heel. And like, I didn't even feel it. You know what will make it feel it? Tempos, or even a pause squat if it's a bottom issue. But like, I just like slowing that thing down, right? Or they do the elbows kick out instantly on the bench press. So they know there's got to be a little bit of a diagonal angle from touching kind of low on the breastbone and kind of locking out over the shoulder joint. And sometimes they'll hit that low on the breastbone and immediately jump up. And it's like, they can't get that bar path fixed. Slow it down, right? So I like that tempo.
Yeah.
I think the best example of that for me, like, and it's an instant fix for so many lifters, is the pause deadlift. Just 1 inch off the floor.
Yeah.
Because if you're not breaking it off the floor, keeping in contact with the shins, doing all those elements, then 2 inches off the floor, all of a sudden holding it, the lats will fail, the bar will swing away from the shins, it'll feel like miserable, and yet they're not committing to the full lift, they're not, going nearly as high. Like, it really does draw attention to it. I think there's a lot, and we can discuss this, especially when it comes to muscles. People are like, oh, X is failing because your glute medius is weak.
Right.
It's like, well, I don't know that.
Right.
But what I do know is you're screwing up the bottom third of the deadlift. So
Right.
let's take a look.
Yep.
I like that.
Yeah, that's good. I want to talk about, because CJ, you started to touch on this, talking about an old coach you had that rotated these in and out like monthly. When do you get rid of the supplemental lift? And so I'll just say what I do. Again, it's different than what I probably talked about a couple years ago on the podcast. I think I probably ran those supplemental lists for 4 to 6 weeks and then would automatically rotate them out. My clients would get personalized programming, but they would be still template based. So I would start with, somebody's on a DUP program or a 12-week block program that I'm getting them ready for. And so I'm like, well, okay, if 12-week block, then every 4 weeks, we're changing the supplemental lift leading into a powerlifting meet. Now, I just ride the supplemental lift until it stops. Like, as long as we're making good progress on the supplemental lift, and it's accomplishing what it needs to accomplish, why would you pull it out? It's working fine. So sometimes as I stick with supplemental lift for 12 or 16 weeks, when I go into programming a supplemental lift, I've never thought to myself, in about 3 weeks, we'll pull this out. I mean, I used to, now I don't. And then I just write it until you can start to see like, okay, we've about squeezed all the juice out of this that we can to get actual progress. And it's time to rotate. Is that how you guys approach it at this point, or a different approach?
Yeah, I'll keep it in there I'll usually linear progress it, either just adding weight to it each week, or I'll add a rep and then I'll add weight, kind of cycle through that until it starts to redline. Then it's like, well, I don't really need to redline barbell rows. Like,
yeah,
I'll just put in something different to get kind of the same goal, accomplish the same goal that I'm going for, and then just add something different in. Or when the client is like, please stop.
Yeah, I hate this lift. Yeah. And then you need novelty again.
Yeah.
If I'm trying to drive an adaptation with a supplemental accessory lift, there's the getting to know you period, where they're trying to figure out the lift and figure out the RP and get feel to it. That usually takes a couple of weeks. Then there's, getting to the right weight, which could be a couple of weeks, could be relatively quick. And then we have to see whether it has an effect, which generally, like, in order to get a good data trend, I need at least a month after they're familiar with it and working at a decent weight, at least a month, usually 2 months. So if I'm looking to drive an adaptation, yeah, we're going to spend, like you said, Matt, 12 weeks on a supplemental lift. And the first 8 weeks of that is just getting it started, really. Now, if I'm using it to drive exposure to a variety of movements, I've got someone from a GoRuck event, doing a GoRuck event or something, and the accessory lifts are like sandbag work. I've got 40 lifts that they don't really need to be genius at, but none of them really should surprise them on the day. So for that, yeah, I'll rotate supplementary accessory work, that third slot, that fourth slot lift, or if they've got, like a couple of different movement targets. For instance, I want to get to a chin-up or I want to get to a pull-up, but they don't have a single one yet. Well, you can't do a pull-up, so it's not like there's one supplemental lift. I've got to drive like 3. I've got to drive negatives. I've got to drive partner-assisteds. I've got to drive a couple of different options. So then as soon as they hit their first chin-up or their first 3-ish, that's what's going to drive the change. So for me, it's, am I driving an adaptation in the core lifts, or are the supplemental lifts their own thing? Like, are they their own ends? In which case, I might rotate them faster.
That's a good point.
Yeah, and if you're starting to need to correct supplemental lifts over and over again to the point where you're like, man, this supplemental lift needs a supplemental lift so I can fix the movement error that's coming up in this supplemental lift.
Right.
Like that can happen when you spend 12 weeks on a power clean and you're just like, man, we can't get weight on the bar. This isn't useful anymore.
Yeah, agreed. It's interesting to think about how just knowing as a coach, as you start to program supplemental lifts, the more novel the lift is, the longer you can probably write it out. So if it's the first time they've ever done a movement, you're probably going to be able to milk more from it for longer than if not. And also what kind of goes along with that often is the advancement of the lifter. And so I certainly wouldn't agree with all the stuff that Louis from Westside said, but the first time they would introduce a lift to these world-class powerlifters, they would do them 3 weeks in a row. And then after that, they would just do it 1 week. They do it 1 week, and then they put a new lift in, and they would have like 6 supplemental lifts. And so they would hit that supplemental lift every 6 weeks. Well, I don't know that that's hardly ever appropriate. As a matter of fact, I would say it's the far end of the spectrum of probably what's not appropriate. But if it's appropriate for anybody, it would be appropriate for world-class powerlifters, right? Like that very quickly, they can figure out a 3-board press. So the first time they do 3-board press, they're already super strong. They have super high motor unit recruitment, especially for this type of lift. They can figure it out within the first 3 weeks of doing it. And then you probably could rotate it in and out relatively quick. But for most people, we're doing it to actually elicit a specific adaptation, like CJ said. For Westside, they actually did it to expose people to as many different things as possible. It's what their idea of conjugate, which I don't know that that's really what conjugate was, but that's what Louis thought it was. And so we're going to expose people to a different lift every single week. And so you just have to be ready to handle something different every week.
And they need to be exposed to redlining. They need to be exposed to
all
that
the time,
RM feel.
frequently. Yeah.
You make a really good point, which is, I was painting there's that familiarity phase, the developing familiarity with the lift and all that kind of stuff. When a lifter has A lot of sedentary lifters, or, I worked out last in college and that was 20 years ago, like that kind of thing they have an empty library. It's like cobwebs and shelves and just smells like funk, of movement, knowledge in their bodies. So, we throw 20 different lifts at them. It's more awkward than it is hard.
Yes, for sure.
Like it takes building up and restocking those internal shells, if you will, with just a library of movement. But if you've got an experienced athlete, my classic example is CrossFitters, you can't throw a new lift at a CrossFitter and expect them to be surprised. Like a games athlete, a regionals athlete, like you throw them something like a strongman movement or something, maybe in a session, they've got that figured out because they have this they're strong. Obviously, they have the capability and they've got a broad movement capacity. So in their case, introducing a new lift, getting it useful, making it useful in their program is fast. So that can shrink the timeline.
Yeah, they're so neurally efficient. And so that applies. Okay, I'm going to rotate to accessory lifts and how we handle those. So CJ, I'll just start with you. How do you approach, so these accessory movements we already talked about, they tend to be a 1 or 2 joint movement. They tend to not be barbell. Occasionally you certainly do barbell accessory movements. They tend to focus more on just a muscle group or even a couple muscle groups as opposed to the whole body. And they tend to be done for higher rep ranges. Not always. Again, there's always outliers on all of these to help drive hypertrophy, volume, tonnage, stress within a single workout. How do you approach accessory movements? First from a 30,000 foot view and then from kind of a in the trenches practical view.
A little bit overlapping from the previous concept. It depends on the needs of the athlete that I'm working with. If they're down the sport mission life chute, then we establish after they've gotten through the core 4, the core 6 of exercises, there's missing pieces there. There are weak spots that come because those 6 exercises don't cover everything. Do you need to get better at, at chin-ups, at dips, at farmer's walks and farmer's carries, things like that for your military test? For the Army PFT, for the Marine Corps combat fitness test, one of those. So that's the first decision is, if life is your competition, what are your competition lifts? Or if your military test is your competition. If I'm looking and what's going to drive up those numbers or just things you want, things that are fun, that's what's my primary driver for that category in the accessory lifts.
I want big arms. I want to grow some calves.
Yes.
Well, okay.
Because calves don't get trained much in the core 4. The big arms just aren't there. So yeah, let's do that.
Yep.
For the strength athlete, where I'm thinking accessory lifts to drive the core 4, to drive the big 3 for powerlifting, something like that. This is where, for me, it's almost always exploratory. Because I would love to think that I could look at a movement and say, well, that's a weak hamstring, or that's a weak quad, or something like that. And therefore, I can focus on muscle hypertrophy in the quad and get gains here. I can't guarantee, and I don't think anyone can, as much as people will claim, can really guarantee a 100% trade-off. Like, yes, you need leg extensions.
Right.
And that's what's going to drive your squat.
You have weak quads, so we're going to do leg extensions, and that will guarantee to drive your squat up.
So
nobody knows that. If they tell you that, they're lying.
Yeah.
Or they're just Dunning-Kruger. They think they know it, but they don't.
I generally keep, the big body parts for the main lifts, your glutes, your quads, your pecs, your triceps that drive up the big 3 for power lifters. And I will slot accessory exercises to drive those. But again, at first, it's going to be general. At first, it's going to be exploratory. I'm going to keep them in because I'm looking to drive an adaptation. It's going to take a couple of months, like 2 months-ish, before we really start seeing any kind of trend. And then between lifter feedback and the trend line that we see, go like, okay, do I need more? Do I need less? Do I need different?
Yep, that's good. The addressing the slots, I think, are important because when we do that, I still follow typical MED principles. So I don't add 3 accessory movements to every workout when I start to introduce accessory movements. I introduce 1 or 2 slots a week on accessory movement and then maybe 1 slot per workout. And then slowly you can increase. So what you're really doing is you're utilizing frequency by increasing slots. It's not the frequency of the lift, but it's doing more lifts. And so you're adding that in. That's a great point. Niki, how do you approach accessory work?
So super bang on with what CJ just said is like, what are the goals of the client and what, muscle groups maybe do we neglect to some extent that we didn't really need, or there wasn't any space to work them in. So like curls and, maybe some extra back work. And it also can be useful if a client is starting to feel like a little bit beat up, if they have certain joints that are just like, man, this joint is talking to me. But you still need to get some sort of stimulus towards the main lift. Then you can start using accessories to be like, okay, I know I need to work these muscle groups, but I can't have you squatting 3 times a week for a little while. I can't have you benching 3 times a week for a little while. So what isolations can I put in lieu of those? Like you said, Matt, we're still in the same slots, but I'm trying to provide like less overall weight and just kind of relax or let some joints breathe for a little bit.
Yeah.
So they're really useful there. And then, yeah, like a lot of aesthetic driven goals, which I think are really fun to throw in a lot of bodybuilding work there for that reason.
Yeah. Yeah, you said a really good point there. The accessory movements often reduce stress on the joint while still increasing stress on the muscle, at least via volume and time under tension and all of those sorts of. So while we may not be able to have the same amount of contractile force from the muscle, given the joints a rest and still be able to get a bunch of work in on a muscle group is very beneficial a lot of times. I didn't do accessory work hardly at all when I was a competitive powerlifter, and strongman was so vast that I did a ton of supplemental work, but very little accessory work also for strongman, because you just kind of had to be ready for all the, tire flips and yoke and stones and log press and all the stuff. And so you would train that stuff. And that was really, I don't know, maybe you'd call it was competition specific. And so that used up the slots. Now, as I've gotten older, the accessory movements are actually what makes me feel better. If I just do the barbell lifts and don't do the accessory stuff, I feel beat up in a hurry. If I take the time to actually do the accessory movements and I go out and do my glute ham raises and my reverse hypers and then do some kettlebell swings or whatever, I feel so much better when I do that. Same thing for upper body, right? I'm going to bench, I'm going to press, I'm going to do some chins or some rows. But then if I go out and do some additional volume on the lat pull down, the curls, the triceps, the dips, the rolling dumbbell extensions, I feel so much better when I do that. And I think some of it is, it's sort of this is totally not a correct physiological word comment, but it kind of feels like it's greasing the groove of the joints have gotten these, several sets of 3 reps and the joints have just taken a lot of beating. And now I'm doing this thing that lets the joint move through full range of motion, but the muscles get to do what they're supposed to do. They get to fatigue. I feel better. And I think it actually makes me better. Maybe it's just placebo. It doesn't even matter, right? After the workout, I'm like, I don't feel beat up. The next day, I feel less beat up. I feel much better. So to me, that's one of the ways I'll work that in. And I think it's also very important for older lifters who are volume sensitive, especially with the big lifts, that we want to often try to drive strength with the big lifts, but we can get the volume from the accessory movements and be easier on their joints. Well, their joints are old. So we can be easier on the knees and the hips and the elbows and the shoulders by doing lighter weight for higher reps with not super heavy barbells. I like it there as well.
Yeah. And we do need to increase the cross-sectional area of muscle, but we can't just keep doing that with 3 sets of 5 low bar squat.
Correct.
If you're 6 years into lifting, we got to start throwing some different stuff at your body.
Right.
I think you make a point with masters lifters and more advanced, more experienced lifters for, anytime that someone's adaptive capacity is low, they're just not going to be gaining results fast, or anytime someone's recovery capacity is low. Accessory lifts have a benefit. I find this for when I'm doing strength programming for endurance athletes. So people who are doing long go ruck events, people who are doing half marathons, something like that. Eventually the training for that, the mileage that they're putting in running or running cycling or whatever blend that they're choosing or that I'm programming for them is pretty exhausting. Yeah. When you've got 10 hours on your feet, 15 hours on your feet running and rucking, you go to the gym and what Matt is saying is being beat up at, his place in training in life. You just get that from your endurance training. So having somebody go in, you're going to do one hard complex lift, the overhead press. And then the rest of your work is going to be accessories because your margin for error is lower. You're mentally fatigued. You're beat the hell up, like physically. Your knees aren't feeling great. So being able to draw down the complexity, brain fatigue, and to reduce that margin of error, but we can still get you lifting heavy and still get you 1 day a week or 2 days a week so that you don't lose that capacity while you bias your endurance training. I find a lot of benefit there. I find people, especially me, like right now, I'm putting in about 10 hours a week of endurance work and then the strength work with that. I often don't have the gas for just the physical to do a squat and a deadlift in the same session. It's just not there.
And let alone 3 sets of 5 or 4 sets of 5 levels of volume there. It is easier. You can actually utilize that accessory work almost as, again, I hesitate to use the term like active recovery, but it's the idea is like, we're still getting a bunch of work done that doesn't beat you up. That's probably a better way to say it, right? It doesn't actually beat the person up. And so I also like, you noted that the accessory work is almost always lower skill. I would argue it should be lower skill. That's why we don't do muscle ups as accessory work. Muscle up is a competitive lift. It's a competitive movement, not an accessory movement. It was the thing that I had to fight the most with CrossFit coaches that, and by the way, my CrossFit coach work for me was great, but when you would fight him, you'd be like, hey, this is too high impact, too high skill to put at the end of a workout where they've already lifted heavy as part of the Metcon. I want all that stuff, including the conditioning stuff. It's why we choose stuff like the Prowler and the Echo Bike and the Rower because they're low impact, low skill, anybody can do them. Okay, that is how we approach supplemental accessory movements, when to work them in. Don't get in a hurry, but also we're giving you permission to use a little bit of novelty when you need it, right? Whether that's for the coach or for the client. And then just, you don't have to understand perfectly why you picked the lift you did sometimes, especially with a new client who's never done these lifts before. It's okay to have some time of exploration to learn what they struggle with, what is carrying over and what doesn't. So that's okay, right? And then I would just argue to add one at a time, the accessory movements, one slot at a time, or maybe a couple, maybe a slot for lower body and a slot for upper body, something like that. And just use those same MED principles. Don't go from, they were doing 9 different exercises throughout the week and now they're doing 17 overnight, right? Like that's way too many. So
I'm laughing thinking about this one client I have who has like a fully decked out gym and he wants to do everything and I kind of want him to do everything. And so
Yeah.
we're like, I think we're like our own worst enemies right now with all of the, the stuff that he's doing.
I have one like that too. He has so many cool toys.
Yeah.
It's actually hard to program for because he wants to use them and wants me to work them in, especially like in the accessory movement, which I do think you can rotate. By the way, we didn't say this, but I do think you can rotate those in and out faster than supplemental movements.
Yeah.
Right? Like I still tend to ride them for a little while.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I think you can rotate. Sometimes my clients will come in and be like, I didn't do the rolling dumbbell extensions today. I did tricep push downs. I'm like, I don't care.
Great.
Did you work hard at it? That's fine. Right? So it really does. But if they had come back and said, I didn't do the deficit deadlifts today, I did rack pulls, I'd be like, what? Right? So think about your reaction even as a coach if they switch the exercise up. I just want them to do a thing that attacks that general muscle group for accessory exercises.
Yeah.
For supplemental, stick with the thing.
And make it difficult.
Yeah, and work hard. And we were talking about this in Denver with Andrew. He said, there is for sure, potentially the most important thing is long-term hard work consistency, right? I mean, if the form is right, obviously, which is we're coaches and we coach all the people that we don't just program for people. So if their technique is good and their consistency lasts and they consistently work hard, they will get benefit. But the benefit takes a while, like especially adding hypertrophy. There's a lot of neural efficiency that occurs early on. And so like when they're gaining strength, people a lot of times are just getting better and better at the lift. They're teaching their muscles to fire a little better, contract better. They're not necessarily adding hypertrophy. At some point, they got to add some hypertrophy. And that takes a long time to add muscle.
Mm-hmm.
Just like it takes a long time to lose muscle.
There's that guy, like every iron gym has this person who's been training for 20 plus years and he's been doing the same thing, but slowly. And every once in a while, he's like, you know what? I want to do some JM presses.
Right.
And there's not really any clear thought process to it, but he's been doing it for 20 years. And you see this guy benching 405. It's that hard work, steady, consistent. I would take that over a detailed mechanical analysis of the weak point of the lift to prescribe for 7.2 weeks, this particular supplemental. Yes, there should be a thought process for a coach, but get in, work heavy.
Yep. Agreed.
Cool.
That is another episode of the Barbell Logic podcast, this time with Niki and CJ and Matt. So we'll see you here next Tuesday. And we got some bonus episodes coming out, I think, on Fridays right now. Some of those talks from the block conference and stuff. So keep a lookout for those. If you have received value from this podcast, either this episode or another, we would love a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. That always helps for us. Changes the algorithm dramatically. When you give us good reviews, it throws us in the Apple suggested, and then we're like, wow, we got 30,000 more downloads this month, which is super helpful. I have no control over that. That's up to you guys. So if you love the podcast, give us a 5-star review.
And if you also want more people squatting and deadlifting, that's how you can make it happen.
That's right. Do it for humanity.
Yes.
Not necessarily for us. Thank you guys. We'll catch you next week.
Bye.
Boom.